Firstly, there were the zealots, who were predominantly peasant farmers, who advocated peasant and slave rebellions against the Roman Empire. One of them, by the name of Simon, who was a freed slave of the Emperor Herod, led an insurrection. They had another attempted insurrection which ended in a disastrous massacre of thousands of slaves in 66 AD. The other group, who it may be said were the direct predecessors of the Christians, were the Essenes. Their outlook comprised an early example of primitive utopian communism. Some comments on this are made in the book by Kautsky.
They live there together, Philo says of them, organised by corporations and clubs for friendship and dining, and regularly occupied in labours for the community. None of them desires to have property of his own, neither a house, nor a slave, nor a piece of land, nor herds, nor whatever else constitutes wealth. But they put everything together indiscriminately, and all of them use it in common. The money they earn by their labour in various ways they hand over to an elected administrator. Out of it he buys what is needed, and gives them ample food and whatever else is needed for life. Not only food, but clothing as well is in common with them. For there are heavy cloaks prepared for the winter, and light outer garments for the summer, so that every man may make use of them as he will. For what one has counts as the property of all, and what all of them have counts as every man.
An important characteristic of the Essenes, apart from the ones which Edwin has just referred to from Philo, which was the communistic practices they engaged in, was the belief of the Essenes in a Messiah. This Messiah was to be sent by God to save the rural inhabitants of Palestine from the powerful Roman state. The rural inhabitants of Palestine were the poorer inhabitants, the slaves who were working on the land, domestic slaves, the poorest peasants who owned small strips of land in Palestine. And this Messiah was going to come to earth, throw off the Roman yoke, and lead them to their emancipation. Christianity emerged out of this same movement. Its Messiah was going to descend to earth and defend the slaves, the beggars, and the city proletarians. Only he was not going to defend them against foreigners. The crucial difference between the Essenes and the Christians was that their Messiah was a class Messiah, not a national Messiah. He wasn't going to throw off the foreigners, he was going to throw off the rich. Christianity, which began as an underground revolutionary movement amongst the worse-off Jews in Palestine, was the first movement in history to be based upon naked class hatred. The early Christians were united by two significant principles. Firstly, they were the lowest classes in the ancient society they lived in. They were the class which was not only the profitless people of the city, but they were the beggars, they were the misfits, they were what Marx refers to as the lumpen proletariat. As the early Christian Jerome puts it, the community of Christ is recruited not from the Lyceum and the Academy, but from the lowest rabble. The early Christian writings, such as the Sermon on the Mount, comprise a fantasy about how the oppressed will get their own back on the ruling class in heaven. The whole of early Christianity is a story of the revenge of the poor, the downtrodden, the lumpen proletariat of Jerusalem against the rich. Take this example from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed be the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. But woe unto you that are rich, for ye have received your consolation. Woe unto you that are full, for you shall hunger. Woe unto you that laugh now, for ye shall mourn and weep. The Epistle of St. James to the 12 tribes continues this proletarian rage. Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl, for your misery shall come upon you. Kautsky gives several examples of this early class hatred of Christianity in his book, and he makes a perceptive point that, quote, Few are the occasions on which the class hatred of the modern proletariat has assumed such fanatical forms as that of the Christian proletariat. Perhaps a few examples of it in these days wouldn't be such a bad thing. The second principle which characterised the Christian revolutionaries was communism. It was utopian communism, it was crude communism, it was visionary communism, it was communism which was historically before its time. But it was communism nonetheless. The modern bigots whose clerical conformity blessed banks and bonds and all of the other paraphernalia of property society would probably have heart attacks if they ever discovered the communist ideas which were inherent in the first Christian revolutionary movement. For example, St. John Chrysostom, in his homily on the Act of the Apostles, states that, and I quote, "Grace was among them, because none suffered lack, for the reason that they gave so generously that none remained poor. But they did not give one part and retain another for themselves, nor did they give everything as if it was their own property. They abolished inequality and lived in great abundance, and they did this in the most praiseworthy manner." But their communism was a religious outlook. Because they were not historical materialists, and how could they be historical materialists, constrained as they were by their own lack of knowledge of science? Because they didn't know how they could act upon history, how they could make history, they invented a mythical Messiah called Jesus to prophesy the coming of socialism by miraculous means. Jesus Christ, through his crucifixion, through his word, through his coming to earth, was going to enact this revolutionary change to bring vengeance upon the rich. Now, there is some doubt about the authenticity of Jesus as a historical figure. My own reading on this, and it's fairly limited, leads me to doubt the authenticity of Jesus Christ as an historical figure. Although I should say, in fairness, because Marxists aren't out to defend every word that every other Marxist wrote, that Kautsky's introduction to the foundations of Christianity, where he doubts the historical existence of Jesus Christ, has been largely refuted by modern theological scholarship. Nevertheless, there is a great deal of doubt still about the authenticity of the existence of Jesus Christ. Others have argued that Jesus Christ was probably a real figure who, like many others in that period, claimed to come from God, attempted to lead an insurrection against the Jews, and was crucified for doing this. This wasn't a very unusual thing. Many people during that period were crucified for precisely the same reason, leading revolutionary insurrections against the Roman Empire and the Jewish control of Palestine. Whether or not Jesus lived does not matter, it is irrelevant to the history of Christianity. That might sound like a paradox, but I think it's not. What we do know is that after he allegedly died, and remember, this revolutionary propagandist managed the great publicity stunt dying twice, there were many apostles who began to claim that they were asked by the Messiah to look after his message. It was a good idea. After all, if you had a trading people, you trade in on someone who's died with a good propaganda message. And they came along and said, look, Jesus may be dead, he may be crucified, he's gone back to God. We've been sent to spread his word. We're here to take his place. Now, in what I think is a very amusing passage, Celsus described how these wandering lunatics in the Middle East would frighten the Christian masses into following them. Maybe we'll read that example.